she wakes in the dark to a second breath in the room, a deliberate inhale that follows hers by the smallest fraction of air and lands like a finger against her ear. When she exhales into it, the taste is faint iron and cold metal, and the noise is too precise for pipes or wind. Someone somewhere is calculating the curve of her lungs, counting the seconds between inhales and waiting, patient, for the moment she stops and counting still. Before we go any further, I ask you a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video. With the time you listened to this story, Mara chalks it up to an old apartment at first. The building leans into every sound, sending pipes and plaster to complain and settle. She tells herself that as she rolls over, that the breath was a trick of cavities in the walls. There are practical reasons. The heater cycles at the same hour. The neighbors sometimes smoke by the stairwell. The air in the kitchen blooms with the sour of last night's takeout. She can almost hear herself arranging excuses, but the breath returns. It comes at the same hour each night, a soft, measured inhalation that curves and lingers where the vents meet the ceiling. Each exhale makes the glass of her bedside lamp tremble, a barely visible shimmy that translates into a shivering sound under the lamp's shade. Mara begins sleeping with the fan on and curls her hand over her mouth, pressing her palm to the skin beneath her nose until her breath tastes of her own skin and nothing else. She keeps the curtains drawn. She leaves the bathroom light on. She counts backward from 100 until her eyes feel heavy and the sound becomes routine. Contradictions begin to pile up like an unfinished stack of mail. Her phone alarm resets itself to the wrong time. One of her shoes is left by the door. The lace is loose when she remembers tying them snug that morning. A faint smear of dust appears on the inside of the bedroom windowpane, a narrow crescent, as if something had reached in and dragged a finger across the glass. The smell of stale coffee appears in her kitchen sometimes at dawn, though she never left a pot on. Her front door clicks shut differently. The bolt doesn't meet the strike at the same angle it used to. She starts leaving a recorder running at night, an old digital device with a red LED she tucks beneath her pillow like a talisman. The house fills with a quiet static that feels paper thin, and the recorder's microphone becomes a patient witness. During the hours when she isn't awake, the files grow and grow. Long, blank-sounding tracks that hum with the building's breath. Occasionally, she finds sections sharp with noise, the soft, wet click of keys as she types, the scrape of a shoe. An exhale that answers her own. Mara sits on the edge of the bed in the mornings and listens back with a small, clinical hope that the playback will debunk the fear. Instead, the recordings make the fear intimate. There is a moment, 3 nights in, around 2 in the morning. The recorder picks up her inhale, that small, private intake before sleep. And then, after a measured silence, another breath, a single deliberate intake that follows hers like a trained thing. It is close enough in the audio to suggest a body only furniture's breadth away. Her own heartbeat moves faster, even as she holds perfectly still, headphones pressed to her ears, wanting the file to show static, to show nothing at all. She reviews the footage with a kind of dispassionate mania. Camera angles, timestamps, brightness, and contrast. The cheap motion sensor camera in the living room often records nothing but the dull roll of the night. Most files contain only hours of empty frames, punctuated by occasional disturbances. A shadow past the hallway, a small point of light, as if a screen had glowed, but the late-night captures are worse than a silhouette. On nights, she didn't think to leave the living room camera running. She watches a man sit perfectly still on her couch for hours, his posture rigid, his hands folded in his lap. He has the patient alignment of someone practicing a ritual. He waits until she drifts, until the microsleep halos around her eyelids thicken. Then, with the precision of long practice, he releases a single, practiced inhalation. The file records as a soft, precise puff that doesn't belong to air or mechanism. Mara rewinds and watches the same minute over and over, jealous of how casual the world looks when seen from that other angle. A living room that could be any evening, a TV glow, a forgotten mug-up close. His presence leaves sensory traces. When Mara walks through the apartment the next morning, she notices the sour tang of unwashed clothes hanging like humidity. There is a ring of dried coffee under a mug on the coffee table that wasn't there the night before. The throw pillow on the couch bears a slight indentation that maps to the curve behind someone's shoulder. Small, stupid things you could always explain. The half-full glass left to evaporate. The lights slightly dimmer after he leaves. But together, they stitch an argument that she is not a lone dot in the recordings. His breath is practiced like a musician's warm-up. He inhales only when she inhales. He times himself to the small irregularities in her rhythm. Sometimes, the recorder captures a smell, as if smelled through a microphone. The stale bitterness of coffee, the sourness of clothes long worn, and an odd metallic tang that makes Mara's scalp prickle. She finds a battered shoebox in a closet she rarely opens, tapes clinging to its brown paper like dried flies. Inside lie plastered strips of paper with dates, a few loose Polaroids with jagged edges, and a stack of voice recording tapes, the kind that click when they turn. She traces the handwriting on the tapes with a fingertip that trembles as if touching ice. The ink is careful, cramped, obsessive in the way that marks something important to someone with no one to prove it to. There is a tape labeled with her apartment number and the exact time she woke on the first night she felt the breath. Her fingers slide under the plastic and lift out a photograph, grainy winterlight. The camera tilted slightly as if the photographer had been in motion when he took it. It is of her kitchen table, the angle strange and intimate, as though the lens had been peering sideways through a gap in the curtains around the edges of the photo. A faint residue of dust, and the cold bite you might feel stepping out into December air. When she rewinds the video and watches the minute where the camera picks him up, she sees him with a clarity that belongs to terrible proximity. He is ordinary in the way predators often are: plain face, ordinary shoes, a jacket folded across his knees. His movements are minimal. He might have been a man who could vanish into any crowd if anyone had looked, but there is a mechanical quality about him. The soft hiss of old tape recorders in the shoebox, whispering over the pixels. The footage makes his patience almost audible, as if each frame stores a faint memory of inhale and exhale. She begins to plan small, cautious tests, sleeping with the fan on, leaving the hall light on, flipping the switch on the spare lamp in the living room at random intervals. She tapes folded post-it notes to the back of the door and checks them in the morning, angling the living room camera to cover a blind spot. She labels the files with neat, ragged handwriting and opens them each dawn like wound dressings, expecting ordinary skin beneath. She trusts nothing now. The footage from 3 nights in a row sat on her laptop like a slow bruise. At first, the clips were little things: door frames, the hallway, a view through the slats of blinds. But then, past midnight, the camera in the living room caught him. He was worse than a shadow, worse because he was precise. He sat on her couch as if the cushions were the only thing keeping a stop on some wound. He did not slouch. He did not fidget. He stared straight ahead, not at the screen, not at the camera, but through the room in a flat, deliberate way that made the air feel measured. Sometimes his hands folded in his lap like a pair of waiting birds. Sometimes one hand moved to the seams of his jacket and stayed there, as if feeling for something stitched to his skin. For hours he never moved, except at the long, particular moments when he held his breath. Her own breathing, filtered through the night microphone, sounded small and domestic trouble, then quiet. Each time she drifted toward sleep, the man's chest would tighten a fraction, and then he would release a single, practiced inhale that slid into the microphone and into Mara's bones. The lamp on the bedside table would tremble with it. Her body would flinch awake as if someone had tapped the top of her skull. The exhale never matched her rhythm. It was one beat behind. Catching the empty space she left, she watched the playback until the room blurred. The grain pulled his features into smears, cheekbones like the edge of a knife, a nose too straight, eyes that kept glinting at nothing. Once, very close to the camera, he reached toward the couch, and the mic caught the soft tearing of fabric, an almost inaudible sound that made the hairs on her arms lift. He smelled like old coffee in the video. She imagined it strong and bitter, and left in a mug at his elbow, a ring of brown and a crust at the rim. Watching him was like watching residue settle. The tapes in his shoebox proved he saw more than she had allowed him to. Mara found the shoebox stuffed under a stack of yellowing menus in the folded closet when she went looking for hard evidence. a shoebox with a lid taped on, and a loop of brown twine knotted tight. Inside, nestled in tissue that crumbled when she touched it, were cassette tapes, actual, old-fashioned cassettes, their reels wound to different spots. Someone had labeled each one in careful, cramped script. Names, addresses, times. She ran a finger over the scrawl and could feel the indentation in the paper where the pen had dug. She brought the shoebox to her desk and set it next to the laptop. It smelled of tape and dust, and the faint iron tang of something that had been kept in cold, like a basement. She fed the first cassette into the deck shed borrowed from a friend, and the tiny motor whirred awake with a loneliness she had never known. There was a hiss, then the press of breath. It was him, close and metallic and too slow. He counted, not in numbers, but in timing, an inhale, a held pause, a release. She recognized the pattern from the video, the practice of waiting. The tape crackled, and between the breaths, someone muttered, a dry whisper of a name. Not hers. She jerked the recorder until the voice snapped, and she rewound, hands suddenly clumsy. Each tape had a date sticker. Some were months old. One, folded at the corner, read her apartment number, and beneath it, in tiny ink, 209 AM. She spread the photographs on the table like a map of trespass. They were small, hot-pressed prints, edges browned, corners dusted with lint. The grain of them made the rooms look off-kilter, wider the angles wrong. There were photos of her kitchen from the sink's angle, of the bed from where the wall lamp threw a half-shielded circle, of the hallway looking toward the back door at a lean that suggested someone tucked into a corner. A few had frost at the edges, a thin white rim that smelled like winter, and the click of icicles. In one, the frame captured her bedroom window from the outside at 209 AM. The glass, a blind black mirror. In another, the lens had caught the underside of her bed, the mattress lifted, showing the hollow dark where the floorboards breathed, where somebody had once whispered and been answered by the house. There were details in the pictures that made her throat close, a shoe left by the door with its lace undone, a smudge of dust on the inside of the bedroom pane, concentric as a fingerprint, a pencil forgotten on the couch arm. In one photo, she saw her own reflection in the microwave door, sleep-swollen eyes, a pale oval taken at a time she knew she'd been asleep. The air in the photos seemed to carry a chill, like the click of a door opening into a morning not made for her. She started a list. Footprints, smells, times, the steady things that someone requires to pick a rhythm. The man did not use doors. He used spaces the way a predator learns a hunting ground. The soffit above the hallway that had a screw loose and gave him access the crawlspace under the eaves, where old insulation rustled like cheap cloth. The gap behind the dryer that breathed warm dust. The photos were not just voyeuristic. They were a map. When she played the tape labeled with her apartment and the 209 AM mark, She thought she would find the sound of someone passing, the scrape of a shoe, a muffled curse. Instead, there was something closer to a ritual, a breath held, minutes of silence. And then, like a practiced release, the sound she had woken to in the dark. He breathed the way a man might breathe into the mouth of an instrument, careful, trained, intimate. Over it, a low scribble of a voice counted the beats like a metronome. At one point, a faint mechanical rattle threaded under his inhale, like the click of tape spooling past a head. The old recording sounded brittle, as if the air itself had been pressed flat against the shellac of the cassette and kept there. She called the precinct, and the voice at the other end was patient in that way that is not quite indifferent and not quite useful. They told her to bring the evidence in. They asked procedural questions. They recommended locks. They asked if she had any history of domestic violence. The word suggested a whole other web. She answered yes and no without meaning to. She left the shoebox in the trunk of her car like contraband and waited for an officer who walked slowly and looked quickly. The officer took the tapes with a polite reverence and promised they would be cataloged. He told her to secure the apartment and to consider getting new locks. He did not sound convinced when she described the man sitting statuesque on her couch, holding his breath like a measured claim. He did not look at the photos on her table, which she had left face up, the edges catching the lamplight. He took a copy of the clips and left his card on the counter, like a small, flat fossil Mara. Discovered then how quickly the world slides toward the ordinary when you ask it to look for the uncanny. There were forms to fill out. A woman at the front desk asked for dates in a tone mired in a bureaucracy that meant she could not feel what Mara felt. The office smelled of scalded coffee and the faint floral of someone trying to seem calm. They took statements. They handed her pamphlets. They suggested a locksmith. They did not offer words for the taste she had been carrying back to bed. Cold metal pressed to the roof of her mouth, alone again. She found a new tape in the shoebox, with no label at all. It was wrapped in gray tissue, and the twine had been slipped under a rubber band, as if someone had been distracted while packing. When she played it, there was no counted breath at first. There was a sound like fabric sliding across concrete, then a breath so close she felt it at the back of her throat. It was not recorded in the living room, but from somewhere smaller and darker, inside a closet maybe, or under the sink, somewhere that pressed the sound against the microphone. Until it popped, she replayed it, until the deck stuttered, until the tape grew thin with use. The breath on that tape was hers, not just the pattern she had fallen into, but the small idiosyncrasies, how she inhaled when startled, the slight hitch when she shifted her head. It was a recording of her sleep, months old. The hair at the back of her neck prickled. The world narrowed to the space between her and the speaker. And in that narrowing, the shoebox seemed suddenly enormous. Within 10th and things in the apartment started to change. as if the space itself had decided to turn a page without asking. On a Tuesday, she found the kitchen cupboard open, a jar of coffee grounds spilled like a small dark comet. On a Thursday, her phone alarm was reset to an hour earlier, and the numbers blinked in a neat, deliberate hand. She would lie awake, listening for that breath, and instead hear the soft scuff of movement that came before it now, like someone settling into patience. The breaths were no longer confined to the dead hour. They began to line up with her small missteps. The time she left the light on in the bathroom, the afternoon she tried to nap on the couch. The recordings in the shoebox had taught him her patterns, and he answered them with the same calm, the same practiced inhalations. Mara started to leave small imprints of herself around the apartment to test the map. Shed set a cup on the window ledge and check if it had been moved. She would sleep briefly on the couch and wake to find the indentation of another body beside her. As if in the night, someone had settled and then gone very still. She would leave the recorder running and leave the apartment just for the proof of it, and come back with the recorder full of rhythms that were not her own. One night, she opened the kitchen drawer and found a picture of herself printed from a frame in her living room, taken in profile while she had sat at the table. The light catching the curve of her earlobe, the photograph had been folded and tucked into the drawer like a pressed flower. It smelled faintly of tobacco and the metal tang of pennies. The fold of it had worn the image so that her face looked softened, as if someone had tried to make her features less distinct to keep them longer. She pressed her thumb to the crease, and the paper left a powdery residue on her skin. She thought of the man on her couch. She imagined him watching the photos, cataloging her rhythms, teaching himself the way her chest caved when she laughed, the way she held her breath at a cliff in conversation. She imagined him listening to the bootlegs of her nights and learning to imitate the cadence of her inhalations. His method, she realized with a cold clarity, was to make himself a gap in her life and shape that gap to resemble her, teach it language, pattern, the comfort of habit, until she could not tell whether the house inhaled on its own or in his voice her sleep grew thin. She moved like someone balancing on a blade. When she did fall into a deep enough slumber that her body stopped fighting, the breath would come, inevitable and placed, and the lamp would tremble. After that, there was always a small change. A shoe shifted under the bed, a page removed from a book, a smear of dust wiped in a circle, as if someone had made room inside her world and rehearsed leaving it exactly as it was. On another tape, there was a voice that was not the man's at all, but a whisper of paper against paper, lists of places, names that were not hers, addresses with times. It sounded like someone reading a ledger. He had collected. He had kept records. The law would handle that, the officer had said, but law moves with light and papers and signed forms. What he had kept on tape and in those photographs were things the law could take but could not unlearn. He had learned her breath. He had cataloged the hollow just beneath it. He had been patient enough to wait. At the end of the last cassette she listened to that night, the tape wound thin and every sound amplified. There was a shift, a footstep, then another. The man across from the camera moved for the first time she had seen. He stood, folding himself like a book closing, and he turned his head once toward the lens. For a moment, the grain stopped being just grain, and his face became a detailed thing, a mouth that had bitten the inside of a cheek, eyes that did not blink often, a crease on the throat like corded rope. He looked at the camera as if it had been a window, and through it he looked at her. He held his breath, and for the space of a heartbeat, the house held its breath with him. Then he exhaled into the microphone, the sound so close it felt like an accusation. She could no longer tell if she had recorded him or if he had recorded her. The shoebox on her desk hummed like a wound. The photographs lay like a trail of spent matches, the evidence gathered in neat piles, catalogued by hand, proved that he had once been inside more than once, that he had sat and listened and written the architecture of her sleeping outside. A car passed, and through a sweep of headlights across the living room wall. Inside, she sat very still and watched the footage again, as if watching it enough times might teach her the margins. How he entered, how he left, the crack in a window frame, the screw missing from the vent, the hole in the soffit that let him move like a wick through the house. She made another list. She drew arrows and circled dates. She pressed her palm to the shoebox and felt the slight give where a cassette had been played the most. She began to understand not only that he had been waiting, but why waiting was a kind of study, and she began to plan how to use what he had left behind to trap him. The shoebox, the tape, the photographs, evidence parading as invitation. Mara had set the cheap speaker beneath her bed and wrapped the cord around a pair of shoelaces to keep it from shifting. The looped breathing played low, synthetic, and steady, the cadence she had trained it to mimic until the sound of her own lungs matched the recorded one. She crawled into the closet with hands that smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear, fingers pressed to a flashlight that was nearly dead. The hinge creaked when she nudged the door open a fraction, and the apartment answered with the small, faithful noises of every night: radiator ticks, the thin clack of something settling in the wall, a neighbor's distant cough. The loop breathed on. She had told herself the speaker would be enough to catch him, to unmask the pattern he depended on, an audible proof that would pull a police uniform into her living room at 3 in the morning. She watched the closet edge, the torn hem of her dress showing like a pale tongue, and waited. Hours stretched thin and elastic, a film of sleep trying to coat her lids, until somewhere in the floorboards, a dry scuff became a shift, and the apartment inhaled differently. He moved with a sort of practiced slowness, the kind of patience that had made the tapes so precise a foot into the doorway. Then another, his outline folding into the dim. For a breath she thought he had not noticed. And then he did the tilt of his head, the pivot of shoulders like a predator finding scent. He bolted. The motion detonated every fear. She had practiced hands scrambled for the closet latch. Her flashlight flared, and she stepped into the closet mouth just as something heavy and human collided with the doorframe. He was smaller than the photographs suggested, pigeon-binned and quick, eyes wide and wet with work that had nothing to do with sleep. His breath was ragged and shockingly human, collapsing into the loop, and then fighting it, sharp intakes, then a single long release that made Mara's ribs twitch. He moved like a man who had practiced holding breath for others, who had learned the moments when a sleeper's body slackens and the air becomes a fragile rope. A uniform's boots answered the sudden noise. The cops were already there, drawn by the tapes Shed uploaded before hiding, and 2 officers shoved him down onto the carpet like a sack with too many secrets. Metal cuffs clicked, precise and final, the sound a small, hard punctuation on the night. They used steady voices. They asked the questions that had to be asked: name, address, whether he had any weapons. He answered in soft, patient syllables, like tape being wound. Names of streets, names of buildings, times scribbled beside each, like a priest cataloging confessions. They bagged the shoebox of tapes, the battered recorder, the camera with its lenses rimmed in dust, and a stack of Polaroids whose edges were nicked from constant handling. Each tape had been labeled in a cramped, ordered hand addresses and times, sometimes a single name, and the plastic cases smelled faintly of nicotine and old paper. The Polaroids were the worst. Skewed angles of Mara's apartment, a photo from behind her headboard, one from the ceiling corner that caught the exact fold in her favorite throw, another that showed the pattern on her bath towel. In the evidence bag, they found more than objects. They found a methodical map, tracked routes to windows, notes about when a tenant went to work, short observations about whether someone slept with a fan or a window, the recorded times that matched up with the tape's labels, an obsession of small facts. Detectives took statements and made lists, spoke in professional tones that were both sharp and hollow. And during one long, fluorescent afternoon, a woman in a suit placed a single photograph on the table and said, quietly, "There are others." Mara slept in 20-minute bursts for weeks, like someone testing whether her body would still obey her. She stopped trusting silence, the way other people stopped trusting certain intersections. Silence had become a texture that might yield a second breath at any moment. At night, she slept with the recording playing faintly, a looped warmth that felt like company. The irony burned like acid. She needed to keep the sound of herself in a jar, or else imagine it altered. Weeks later, in a precinct that smelled of coffee and recycled paper, Mara watched as officers opened one of the shoebox tapes and threaded a spliced reel through an ancient player. The room filled with the hiss of tape, and then a low, intimate sound. Her own breathing, older and thinner, than the one she recognized now. Folded into the weight of a winter night, she felt suddenly veilleur and victim, and an odd kind of curator, someone who had been asked to archive the truest part of her. The detective glanced at her, the only expression a kind of tired apology, and said, "He collected breaths the way other people collect stamps." She took the cassette back home that night. Because evidence had become a talisman, it sat on her kitchen table in a Ziploc bag, small and mundane and obscene. She played the file in the dark, willing the living room couch to hold its breath like a witness. At first, it was only ambient noise, the distant hum of traffic, a ceiling fan somewhere, the tiny click of a clock. Then the breath came, the older one, measured and patient, and beneath it, a curious thing, an edit point, a faint splice where two nights had been sewn together. She listened for the tiny toss that marked a human waking. Instead, she heard a pause that felt rehearsed, like a recorded actor holding a line. There was intimacy there, no legal term for it. The way someone learned the pattern of inhalation so precisely they could predict a cough, a move, the soft intake that preceded a dream. Mara folded inward. A noise escaped her throat that might have been a laugh or a strangled apology. She thought of all the nights she had felt watched, and of how the recordings made those nights physical, transferable objects she could show to a jury, but never unhear inside her head. Days passed with the legal machinery grinding around the arraignments. Paperwork, a threadbare bail, hearing where the man sat with a blank face, and a muffled look of satisfaction. She learned the shape of his crimes in lists and attachments, 6 to 7 addresses in a single county, dozens of tapes, hundreds of hours of listening, each file a map to someone's private night. And yet the worst proof was simple. The cassette in her bag hummed with the exact rhythm of her own sleeping, just the night she had first noticed the second breath. That file could not be unmade. He had recorded her in pieces and stitched those pieces into minutes she could play back any time he chose, and he had chosen to keep. Sometimes at night, she dreamed the man was a seamstress, fingers nimble, weaving threads of breath into a garment that fit her perfectly. Months later, after courtrooms and restraining orders, Mara sat on her living room floor and listened to one more file. She had convinced herself the sound would be a clean thing, confirmation that he was done, and she was safe. Instead, the cassette offered her a younger breath, the one that belonged to the woman who had not yet learned the lengths someone could go. A breath with all the small, ignorant inflections of someone who had once believed her apartment was private. She listened until the tape ended, and the player coughed and went quiet, and the silence that followed felt like a verdict she could not appeal. Her hands shook when she folded the empty cassette into its case. The plastic was unexpectedly warm from the machine, like a small, used thing. She understood. Mara, like and subscribe.